IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Saurabh Todi and I have with me my colleague Shambhavi Naik.
Hello.
Today we're going to discuss the Green Revolution, and this is because the key architect of that revolution, Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, recently passed away. So we thought it was very important to kind of discuss the crucial role Dr. Swaminathan played in ensuring that India's self-sufficiency in food grains, and from the time where we had to import food grains to now like exporting, and which has been there for a long time. So we'll just discuss the journey of what the issues were and how the whole process happened, and the intersection of policy and science, how the science tackled the issue of low yields and low productivity, and now how I think policy has been left wanting to address the consequences of that change with the need for a second green revolution. So a very warm welcome, Shambhavi.
Thank you, Saurabh, and hello to all the listeners. Yeah, I think it is quite a saddening day for India to lose Professor Swaminathan. I think as you said, he was the architect, of the father of the Indian Green Revolution, and really shaped our journey into accepting new technologies and taking us from food imports to being self-sufficient in our own in growing our own greens, right? As a child, obviously, I mean, I don't think there are going to be very few people in this country who have not heard of the Green Revolution in some shape or form. Maybe that not that exact term, but in their own languages, they would have known of this landmark event that occurred in our history. As a child, obviously, so studied in the textbooks. The Green Revolution made us the breadbasket of grains, and you did not really think a lot of what might have gone behind it. Then, when I was actually studying biology, I kind of started understanding the science behind creating high-yielding varieties, and the fact that it is not so easy. There are various technologies. You have to find the one that works best for you, etc., and got a deeper appreciation for how we managed to achieve this in the 1960s and 70s. And then, as a policy analyst, when I got back to the Green Revolution and saw the policy side of it, I think, it just unraveled the layers of nuances that go into creating something that can so dramatically change the future of a country. Right, and so I thought on his passing, we should delve into this layers. It has been, I think, quite remarkable. It also just goes to show what determination with one person can achieve.
Yeah, definitely. And so for our listeners, can you give like a brief overview of what exactly was Green Revolution, and why it was such a big deal for India in the 60s?
Right. So in the 60s, we were importing a lot of our grains. We were also growing grains. About 70% of our population was still dependent on agriculture, but it was clearly not keeping up with the demand. And so we were 1 to 1.5 tons per hectare of wheat, which is quite low, whereas internationally they were getting 4.5 to 5 tons per hectare. And I think for Professor Swaminathan, it was, I think, mind-boggling that a country which was so heavily dependent on agriculture was not able to meet its own demands. That import bill was obviously pretty high. India was not, this was obviously pre-1991 India as well. So there was this need for kind of making ourselves self-sufficient as an agricultural country in rice and wheat. Professor Swaminathan obviously was not originally a wheat expert. For his PhD, his postdoc, he was studying potato genetics. But this was in the UK and the US. But when he came to India in 1954, he started hearing about a Japanese scientist who had made a Swamidav variety of wheat in Japan. And so he thought that, look, there are two things that we need to do. One is that the Indian variety was not very fertilizer responsive, as in it could not take up a lot of fertilizer. This is because our plants were longer and they had long and weak stems, so they would fall over if you had a lot of greens. So if you had bigger greens, they would fall over, and we would lose yields, right? And so the yields were about 1 to 1.5 tons per hectare. If you had to increase the yield, you would also have to give a lot more fertilizer, and the plants would not have been able to take that up. And so he was trying to think about how we could create plants that could then be short stems so they wouldn't fall. So shorter, stronger stems so that they don't fall because of the grain weight. And could also take in the fertilizers and be able to give more yield. Right. So these are the two problems that, from the science point of view, we were trying to solve. He approached a Japanese scientist for their varieties, but the Japanese scientist said that there was someone in the US who was also working with them, but they later found out that the wheat that they were cultivating were was to be grown in the winter, and so might not be suitable for it from the Indian point of view. So they wanted to figure out another variety which could be suitable for cultivation in India, and that's when he stumbled onto Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution, global Green Revolution. And Norman Borlaug had been making his dwarf varieties of wheat, which would be what you needed: the short stems, the strong stems, and responsive to fertilizers. And Swaminathan then wrote to Norman Borlaug, and we started experimenting with the Mexican varieties of dwarf rice. The first of which, the Sonara 6364, came into India in 63. They tried to do this in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh and Punjab, in Ludhiana, actually, in 63, 64. And they found that we had now moved from 1 ton per hectare yield to 4 and even 4.5 tons per hectare yield, which was, amazing. There seemed to be a lot of hesitancy before for farmers to take this because it seemed unreal that you could just suddenly, go 4 times your yields. And it was fantastic. And from then on, but again, this is where the science actually showed that we could actually increase yields, but the political need hadn't yet arisen. That arose a couple of years later because we had consecutive drought years, food production fell considerably, and therefore we had to rely a lot on imports. And that was when I think the imports peaked in 1966 in what is called the ship to mouth situation. And then that actually forced the government to kind of think of how we can use science to supplement agriculture in India itself. That's when we started importing the seeds of these draft varieties. Then our food production rose from 95 metric tons in 66, 67, 68 to 108 metric tons in 70, 71. And it subsequently kept on rising, and the rest, as they say, is history. But it was pivotal, I think, for India's confidence and India's agriculture, that we became self-sustaining at that point of time. And I think it's a really nice example of how, when there is political will and there is enough science to show safety and efficacy of something, we can achieve really drastic outcomes.
Yeah, and and to see that, like the success was also quite rapid, right? It was only like a few years later that like the yields kept on increasing, and India finally was able to wean off the import dependence. And then obviously with this technology now, and then with firm backing of both the government and farmers, India then started to develop their own varieties of these hybrids, and which then spread to many other crops. So, but I'm wondering, Shambhavi, so it seems that it took like some kind of a shock, which is like those 2 years of drought, to kind of push the government into action, that okay, this is something that we need. And now we see that obviously the green revolution was great, and it really helped India and everything. But if you see that the consequences of green revolution, in the sense that it pushed the use of fertilizers a lot, pesticides, and also a lot of water, and all of these resource kind of consumption. Dr. Swaminathan also warned as early as the 60s also, that you have to balance these, like the idea that you can indiscriminately use resources for this cultivation was warned by him. But I think, as we see already in India, even now, that the huge amount of subsidies and huge use of water, then especially in Punjab, for example, like the groundwater is almost gone, and it's heavily dependent on MSP and all other kind of subsidies. Where do you think is the scope for kind of change to this approach, or like how can you have a new approach where the after effects, or not a side effect, but like the in a cost benefit kind of matrix, the benefit of having high yields and being self sufficient is great, but the cost that we incur for that, how do we address that?
Right. I think, Saurabh, the key lesson for us to learn from Green Revolution is that policy has to be science driven. What we have seen, and I think Green Revolution is a classic example of that, is policy is politics driven. I mean, intuitively it makes sense, but the problem is that then you have to incur these very high costs, right? So the first part you started about how we did this in a crisis situation. And one of the things about any emerging technology, and this was emerging back in the 1960s, right, is that it takes time to flesh out its consequences. And so if you do it in a crisis situation, you're not always thinking it through, trying to understand what the long-term outcomes can be. And we see this time and again. I mean, as recently as earlier this year, GM mustard, indigenously developed mustard, was blocked by the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court said, hey, there's no compelling reason for us to use GM mustard. We already have enough mustard. And this is the problem, right? This is what policy and policy makers and the judiciary has to realize. Emerging tech cannot just be dropped off in a crisis situation, expected to take care of everything and not have consequences. That is not how it works, right? So I think that's the first question, that whenever it comes to emerging tech, we have to be extremely careful with its use, and we have to give it the time that it requires. We cannot just say that, hey, let's wait for things to go really, really south and then do something and try to salvage the situation. So that for me was the first part. The second part was listen to your scientist. I mean, Professor Swaminathan was saying back in the 60s, I mean, when he brought these varieties, right, that this could be a problem. But even a few years ago, he was saying that, Punjab should not have, we should not have free electricity for farming, etc. And we could have, I think, put in enough measures to kind of solve for these. But because the policies have been politics driven, I think that those would have been really hard to kind of execute. And again, that is a disconnect between science and policy. So I think if policymakers continue to look at science and technology as only a solver of things once in crisis, we will always keep on being in this loop. I mean, even today we hear about gene editing with GMOs, and everyone's like, but why do we need this? But the thing is that those technologies will also require time and attention. They will have long-term consequences. And the thing is, everything has long-term consequences, right? Everything that we do impacts the environment in some manner. So it is not that it is a flaw only of the emerging technologies. It is a flaw that we have not been able to give enough attention to thinking through how we can mitigate those risks, how we can balance those risks, right? Stubble burning, for example, I think is a very classic. Everyone now says, oh, green revolution was bad because short stem varieties, cattle doesn't feed, people burn, Delhi smoke. I think that could have been other things we could have.
Yeah, it's very easy to blame things, but like the consequences, I mean, the steps that one should have taken, both in terms of society and the government were not taken, and then the blame then goes to the science part of it, which is a very wrong way to approach this.
Right. I agree with that. And the thing is, we haven't learned that lesson. And time and again, we continue to kind of fall into the same trap of, hey, why should we deploy this technology in pilots and, in small scale? And then, there is no need right now. Let's just keep it. And yeah. And then when we deploy it, obviously, we can't think through it. And then we have these issues. And then we're like, oh, the technology was bad in the first place. No, the technology. It is the way you apply it that needs to be regulated.
Yeah.
And then the usual answer is that, hey, let's find more technology to fight whatever issues there were with the older technology, and you go into this cycle.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
So, that, as you said, the GM crops is a perfect example, right? Is that GM crops have been used across the world, and they have been they have been proven to be almost safe. And now the concern also regarding foreign seeds have been taken care of by Indian labs and companies trying to build those. But this opposition, which is mainly political, and stems from fear mongering, it shows that how important it is to have science driven policy, and the government and then politicians and then policymakers have to ensure that you educate people enough, and you ensure that any misinformation or concerns regarding the technology or its effects are addressed, and you don't wait for a crisis. Because it's correct, right? Do we have to wait for a sustained drought to happen for us to realize that, okay, you know what, we still need GMOs, at least in some areas, to increase our yield, especially with now with climate change and water scarcity and whatnot. We are just it's kind of sad, but also very short-sighted, that we are just gonna wait for the next crisis to happen, and then we will wake up to this fight, okay, let's just do GMOs, and then we may then end up doing something which may not be as great as if you would have done it in due course of time.
Right, and we have seen enough cases in other countries. We saw Kenya very recently. Kenya had a ban on GMOs, and very recently they had to remove it, even for import, because they had droughts for several years. We saw Sri Lanka try to experiment with organic farming, and how that affected their economy.
Yeah, that was crazy.
So, it is quite apparent. And so it just makes sense for us to kind of invest in creating those technologies and keeping them ready. The second part, obviously, about the Green Revolution was the fact that there was economics involved. And obviously, we were going to increase supply of a product by many-fold, and almost immediately, right? So in a very short span of time. And so there was obviously fear that prices will crash because there will be a sudden increase in supply. And therefore, we introduced the concept of the minimum support price. And the minimum support price, I think there was a calculation that was made which included a number of things on basis of which the MSP was to be created. But then the government decided to reduce that, and therefore the MSP, I think, has been a sore issue for a long time, right? Farmers will continue to say that the MSP is very low. Others will continue to say, hey, why could we not just open up other markets at that point of time when we were going to have more supply than demand, rather than introducing the MSP and let farmers have access to more markets and increase demand that way, instead of trying to control supply prices. And so it has been a learning curve, I think, for everybody in the agricultural ecospace, the scientists, the farmers, economists, on how we can really best look at consequences of bringing in a new technology, which is going to drastically change supply and demand landscape, and optimize solutions to kind of mitigate some of the risks that they will bring out. So yeah, I think the MSP also is a very interesting case study.
Yeah, and I think a few things have happened, right? For example, like the 3 farm laws that were supposed to address some of these issues, then in that case, you had the intersection of politics and policy and then science. At the same time, I'm wondering, Shambhavi, like with this new challenges, right? Like with climate change, declining water table, erratic monsoons, and at the same time, the global kind of this push towards organic food, and then even Indian government is has some programs now to push for more organic farming. What do you see is the like the contours or the structure of like if we say green revolution 2.0, like what does that entail? We already now have technologies like CRISPR, gene editing and all, which makes editing genes much easier, much faster, and much more specific and direct. So what do you see, like what can we expect globally? And second, what do you see is the future of these technologies in India? Because I mean, agriculture still in India is very archaic. Like we have not really. I mean, the most thing we have done in agriculture is to introduce hybrids and make farming more mechanical. That also is not as uniform. But I think our agriculture sector is still many decades behind. So, what do you see? Is the future of agriculture, and then a future of agriculture in India in the context of a newer green revolution?
I think there are two really broad phenomena that are globally trending right now. One is an increased emphasis on the bioeconomy. I think many countries are now recognizing that a shift to a bio-based economy is going to be critical for sustainable development and for fighting climate change. And part of that is obviously moving away from fertilizers and pesticides to biofertilizers, biopesticides, trying to find natural methods, use stuff like gene editing for creating higher yielding crops, etc. To also for fighting off climate resistance, or creating drought resistant varieties, or creating pest resistant varieties, so you don't actually have to use pesticides. And that I think has so far manifested itself through GMOs, and I mean crops such as soya, alfalfa, corn. Most of our cultivation is GM based. It's not in India; it's in the US and it's in Latin America. But we have, I think, moved towards that. Right. The other specific demand is obviously going to come from biofuels, as you know. At the G20 summit, also we spoke about this global biofuel alliance, which means more countries are going to move to biofuels, which means there's going to be an increased requirement for crops and biomass, which means that basically agriculture, there's going to be tremendous strain that will come on agriculture to meet up with these demands, which means that to increase yields, we will see more GMOs and gene editing, genetically edited crops. Now, so far, EU has been quite resistant to getting GMOs. And that is quite well known that they are very risk averse when it comes to genetic modifications. However, there was a report that came out a couple of months ago where they said that the EU was actually considering allowing certain genetically edited crops. So there are various levels of gene edits that can be done. From I won't go into the technical details of it, but they are called SDN1, 2, and 3. And SDN1 and 2 is likely going to be allowed in the EU. It's under consideration of whether they should allow it or not. Which by itself also is a big move for the EU. They are allowed, for example, in India already. Allowed as in you still have to take permission, but they are not as strictly regulated as genetically modified. Which means there seems to be an attitude shift to allow gene editing crops. So obviously, the difference between genetic modification and gene editing is very subtle. Gene modification is you're taking a gene from a different species and putting it into a plant. And gene editing is when you're changing the DNA of the plant itself, right? Subtly within the plant, but you're not taking something from outside the plant and putting it inside. But if there is a global shift to gene editing, then I think that would be a welcome move for agriculture, for technology, and for climate change. So that I think is the first big shift in global trends. The emphasis on bioeconomy being critical. And the second is this idea that we can accept technology. One of the problems with technology is that as long as if there are no global standards, then people will always think, oh, should I do it or should I not? So one of the reasons, for example, we don't see a lot of GM soya in India is because people argue that our soya is non-GM, so it has EU markets. And if we buy GM soya, if we cultivate GM soya, then EU might stop buying from us because it's very difficult to then isolate between those two, distinguish between those two. And so this unification of a market and an increasing strength or stress on moving to agriculture, I think, is going to be vastly influence what will happen next. From an Indian agriculture perspective, I think within India we have two markets, right? We have the large landholders and then we have the marginal landholders. And what we really require, I think, is separate policies. Um, what we obviously, like Professor Swaminathan has continued to say, rethink our subsidies and the tax breaks that we give to agriculture, because I think it can be a self-sustaining sector in any, it should be, right. So that's the first. The second is we obviously have to emphasize on using technology it where it benefits. We have seen farmers, for example, in Maharashtra, continue to ask for GM crops to be grown, to be allowed in the country. Um, I think we need to give agency to the farmers where possible, and we need to give agency to our customers where possible. So that, I think, is going to be critical. We also have to, I think, focus on our biodiversity. Very recently, we have loosened our laws both on biodiversity and forest protection. I think we just need to have a very stronger focus on bringing agriculture back in a very sustainable kind of. Our big problem, obviously, is going to be that we have a very strong anti-GMO lobby, which might also spill over to gene editing. But again, I think with coherent policy, this is all tackleable. Our problem with GMOs was that the anti-GMO lobby was there before we actually have a policy, and therefore the entire narrative has been muddled. But I think with gene editing, we should have better policies, more transparent data, and ensure that people have all the correct information that they need to make an informed choice on whether or not they want to buy genetically edited.
Thanks a lot, Shambhavi. That was very comprehensive, and I agree. I think that the greatest tribute to Dr. Swaminathan would be to preserve the gains that we have that we accrued from the Green Revolution by ensuring that we address the problems caused by by that approach. At the same time, we then follow up with his advice and what scientists are saying now, and make changes in our approach to then embrace new technologies to now go into the next level of Indian agriculture, where we again don't wait for a crisis to happen and we do it organically, as in slowly, steadily with rules, and not organic farming. I should clarify that. I mean, organic farming is good for a certain subset of the world market because that's in vogue, but to kind of, I think it would be a great, I mean, as we saw in Sri Lanka already, is that this idea that you can, go back to the olden ways is just not sustainable. And I hope we don't fall into that trap.
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to understand is that there is not going to be a one solution that fits all for the Indian market, right? We have to have invested in different things. Yeah, again, with gene edited crops as well, or GMOs as well, they might fail. We have seen this with BT cotton. The pest will eventually get resistance. That's just evolution. That's just natural. It's not a flaw of the technology either. But we have to be prepared for it, and therefore we have to put our eggs in various baskets. I would, before I end, I would like to just make a thank to articles that I read about Professor Swaminathan, from which I've heavily used the information that I have given today, and we will link the articles also in the podcast.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Shambhavi. It's a sad day for Indian agriculture and in Indian science, but at the same time, I think we really thank Dr. Swaminathan for his efforts to ensure that India was not import dependent on food grain, on something as crucial as just food security. So thanks everyone, and see you in next episode.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.